All right, so hopefully that introduction to implicit bias and microaggressions, both the impact and what we know about some of the studies regarding the intent, was helpful as you think about your own work. Now we're going to try to shift a little bit more directly to what's happening in these dependency cores, in your everyday work with each other. And again, so just to be clear, I'm not an expert on your work. Okay, so I think about bias and microaggressions and how that impacts folks on a day-to-day basis in a number of different contexts. But I'm going to rely on you all to tell me, okay, where do you see it? Now, I've heard and talked with different folks, read about it. I think I've found some places where there's definitely bias, and maybe perhaps ways that we can intervene. But some of this comes from my conversations with social workers from DCFS, right? And around this dependency pipeline, if you will, or this decision-making map that they go through, not just here in California, but across the country. So there's these referrals that can come from anyone. I would say that's probably the first moment of potential bias, right, for the different families that we serve. Why someone is issued a referral, and some of the research on this says that different families or communities are referred more than others. Okay, we know this. I mean, we could apply this to other contexts, like, you know, like if you're at Starbucks, right, or if you're in a dorm, right. So you might get something called on you by the basis of all that stuff that we talked about. And I'll give us a timeline about where that comes from and some potential things. I really feel like you all could there could be interventions here around this part. Okay, so these screen-ins and investigations, or maybe the screen-out. There's bias in that part as well, right? Who gets screened in towards an investigation? Which investigations lead to substantiated sort of findings that then lead into either a removal from the space, in-home services, or the case closed, and finally the placement, kinship care, institutional placement. Would you all say you think you could intervene in this area here, or after there? No? After. Okay. I'm gonna push on that based on what I talked, right? Based on what I've learned to talk to other folks. And maybe it's pie in the sky, but I have some ideas that I maybe want to run by you all. Okay. So you all have seen these reports, right? The family strengths as noted in the DCFS jurisdiction and disposition reports. Okay? Now, we're going to give a different example. These are pooled in aggregate, right? But just some examples of what you all see when you get these reports, and then what the court officers, right, hearing officers, receive as well. So this is an example of African American family. This is the family strengths. They say, the mother appears to have the support of her mother. The MGM indicated that she is willing and able to provide permanency to the children. Okay, that's the family strengths for African American. That's example A. Okay. So example B is a Hispanic or Latinx family. The children are healthy. The children M is released to her father. The child M is released to her father. Child S is placed with a relative. Okay? And we'll do one more example from Latino. So the mother is willing to comply with DCFS orders. The mother is employed. The father is employed. All right, you've seen reports like this. Okay, kind of common. All right, now we're going to do example C. Example C is a white mother and Asian father. Same family strengths. Okay? As to the mother has been cooperative with DCFS. The mother has begun participating in the PRO's case plan. The mother has been in counseling since October 2011. The mother appears to have a strong bond with her children. The mother took appropriate action to protect the children once she became aware of the allegations. The mother has been emotionally supportive of the children. As to the father has been partially cooperative with DCFS. The father has begun participating in the PRO's case plan. The father has begun counseling. The father appears to have a strong bond with his children. The father has been visiting with C regularly. The father has been active in the lives of the children. And it continues. The father has a strong family support system. As to the children doing well academically in school. The children are developing age appropriately. The children have a strong family support system. The children are physically healthy. And we'll do one more example of a white family. Both parents have made their two daughters their priority, despite the many emotional and behavioral problems with their daughters. Parents have actively participated in various counseling modalities and programs, and have completed parenting-related classes. They have cooperated with home-based counseling service professionals in their home and availed themselves of services. parents have educated themselves on services and schooling that would best serve their daughters. Okay. Any issues that we find with some general examples about Black, Latino, and then white families? Any issues of bias that you see? I'm going to ask you all to talk with your neighbor about what you see in the differences between these two examples, and whether or not it comes up in your day-to-day work. Thank you. All right, great. So we have a lot to talk about. So what do you all see? What's happening in these different scenarios? Real scenarios, right? Of reporting for DCFS.
Well, if I was, because I had asked somebody what the first one said, but there was one, and he told me that the problem with the African American family, that they said support, but then the last thing he said, maternal grandmother would be good for permanency, which means this social worker figured these parents weren't going to do what they needed to do, so the permanent plan, we could feel safe that it's going to go to the grandmother. You know, permanency has a bad taste in my mouth for our clients when we represent the parent. It's not a good sign. So, you know.
And then that last family, we would not even see that in the report because those kids would never be detained.
So the last example, the white family, they are kind of exception. That's like exception to the norm. We don't see those types of families. That also kind of. So in that case, I think that both parents were actually adoptive parents, and they were highly educated. But one of the parents was a UCLA PhD holder, and she was very highly educated. So she's not the norm of the clients that we get. So that's why you see a lot of things in there, because they are the people who adopted through the CFS.
Don't take that personally. Turn the lights on.
And also the kids were detained from the parents.
Okay.
So.
I think that we would, I'm not going to say these examples were picked to make a point, but I think we could see these examples across all races, because for me, it depends on the quality of the social worker. Because I've seen the same, like, strengths for a family regardless of their race. I think there's other factors that are impacted.
I think what really jumped out for me was the bond with the child, and that was only mentioned in one of the families, when I'm sure that there's a bond with the child for all these families.
So, what do we think is the problem then? I mean, let's say that these exemplars are somehow indicative of a larger narrative or discourse or framing around families by race, or with race being a variable in that framing. Where do you think that's coming from? Do we think, you said these aren't the typical families that we serve, so the typical families, do we think it's the lack of resources for the family that might lead to these reports that stem from social inequality, right? You know, black people, Latinx folks, Southeast Asian folks have less access to jobs, greater trauma, higher rate of maladaptive coping, right? Higher rate of drug use, right?
I think a lot of our clients wouldn't even be in the dependency system but for the fact that they are minorities. I think if they were like a nice little white family, that they would never come to the attention of anybody, and everybody would stay the hell out of their lives and let them deal with their kids themselves. I could have a client who's like black or Hispanic that shouldn't be in court, it's some bullshit thing, and then I can go home and have a drink and watch white people let their kids run around like throwing themselves over balconies, nearly killing themselves, and they're never going to have a case here. So I think a lot of it has nothing to even do with the people so much as it has to do with society and systemic racism and all that at large, and the fact that people want to make them the focus when there are a lot more important things to focus on. And I find that the reports are very analogous to like when you see news stories. It's like they choose to focus on certain things. You can choose what you want to focus on. They could have said that maybe about all those families, but they didn't feel the need to go into the detail. And you see like, you know, a story in the news where a black person maybe is a victim, but they want to choose to pull out that they, you know, took a hit off a joint when they were 12 years old and focus on that rather than the fact that they were an innocent victim and had nothing to do with it, versus like a white person could go up into a church where people are praying and kill 9 people, and they're gonna like talk about, you know, what a nice boy they were, and oh, this something happened to them in their life, that's what brought them here, and make the excuses and things and stuff to justify their action, whereas the other side, there is no justifying it no matter what. Thank you.
I think like the most example that I could give is that when we get a report, you read a report for a long time, and you were wondering, well, the kids are all obviously detained because dad is using drugs. Dad admits that he has been using drugs for a long time. He's testing positive. That he's harming the kids. His parents are saying he's harming the kids, and you were like, oh, obviously it's detained, And then you look at the license, not detained. And you're like, why is it not detained? Like, it's so weird. And then you go out and meet the parent, oh, because it's a white kid, And you read the same report, and the children, maybe the parent is like used one time, went to a party and messed up, and they're very regretful, they're very remorseful, they're begging and asking for referral, for give them help and everything, and you're like, it's detained, and you're like, why is it detained? And you go out and meet the parent and be like, they're Hispanic or if they're African American. And that's what I think it makes me really, really angry, is that based on your social status, based on your skin of your color, sometimes I think the social worker also has these biases. They give more support and trust to the white family than give it to the Hispanic or the African American family who are begging for that help, and they would not give them help and take their children first.
I think if we would just think about the non-detained petitions with the moms who tested positive for a drug.
Correct.
I think every single time, if it's non-detained and white, every single time.
Every single time.
Yeah, I've never seen it I mean, as far as I know, I've never seen a non-detained petition with those facts where the family's not white.
It's what happens in greater society. It's a health problem if it's a white person, while meanwhile they've been locking up the black community for decades over the same things, and just seeing it as degenerates as opposed to, oh, it's a drug problem and health issue.
Yeah. Yes.
One of the things that popped up to me, I haven't been doing this for very long, but one of the things that popped up to me almost immediately was how often a DS marijuana charge would pop up on a petition for certain people and not for others.
Yeah.
And I feel like there'll be fathers specifically who are mostly non-offending in any way. And then all of a sudden they're like, oh, but he has marijuana, so we can't give him kids. And just like, marijuana is, first of all, legal in this state, but it's just very specific, usually African American males who get this BS charge.
Yeah. Well, studies show that you are kind of right on track here. This study found that families which are disparately white, that have been substantiated as physically or sexually abusing their children, are more likely to keep their children and receive services in the home. On the other hand, families which are disparately black, that have been found to neglect their children, are more likely to have their children taken from them than are white families who have been substantiated as engaging in sexual abuse. So neglect is an interesting way of framing harm, and when you look at neglect across the board around race, black families are far more often to be tied to neglect, right? And how we discursively frame different communities is really interesting, right? Within your work, at least. So studies show that black families are most severely overrepresented, about 3 times the rate of white families, at acceptance for investigation or assessment, despite no evidence to suggest that black children were abused more severely than white children. Studies also revealed that the higher rates of substantiation for blacks than white, and that Latino children are disparately affected as well, since Latino families are more likely to have substantiated cases than their white counterparts. Cases involving Latino children were also brought to the system more quickly, with less time devoted to assessment than the time referred to from the time of referral to the time of substantiation, right? So it's actually across the board for all these different groups. You're in this dependency pipeline. I'm sure that what you're saying, I don't know if y'all knew, but it lines up with what we know to be true about the system, right?
Does it include statistics for Native American children?
Not that I found. But an interesting reality around Native Americans, if we think about history, and I'll show a timeline in a moment. So for me, some of the first cases that you all would have been fighting, right, as a group, would have been those Native American boarding schools, right? Those have been the first places where you would have been fighting, or your precursors, your predecessors, the ones who were doing the work hundreds of years ago, were fighting to stop indigenous youth from being taken out of their communities and put into these places for the good of them, because their families weren't considered capable in many ways. That's where we see some of the first movements by the state to take children from homes. So for me, it's just a continued process, right? And of course, we know the history of black people around movement from families, right? So I suggest, well, before I offer any suggestions, what do you all think you can do about that? About that fact, that reality? Those are the reports, right? And those are going to be the reports that are read and heard. What if mom and dad are not there, right? So you're not there. They're not there with you. Sometimes it happens, as I understand it. So that's all you all have to go off of, right? Or you can't really necessarily. How do you add to the context of that report? So there's a block there. What else do you think what are your strategies, I guess? What are some of your strategies intervening, knowing that this is happening?
When I sit down with a black mother or a black father, the first thing I tell them, this system is racist, and you are going to get fucked over because of the color of your skin. And that's going to happen. And I say, I agree with you 1,000% that is fucked up and wrong, but I don't think that this is the context to fight that battle. And I'm advising you that this is not where we're going to have that battle, because they got your kids, and we need to get your babies back.
Okay.
So you're going to have to go along to get along. Now, if you want to have this battle after you get your kids back, I think that's great. But for now, do not engage in that battle, because it'll just give them more fuel for their fire. Keep your children and bust up your families. So that's the first thing I say. And then, you know, with regard to how are we going to change it, I frankly don't think we can change it. I frankly think that the dependency system is it's a nexus of all of the problems that are afflicting our society. And all of those problems are going to be solved outside of the dependency system, because the dependency system is only a reflection of the sickness that you mentioned earlier of this society, but it is not the place where we're going to solve this problem, because it's so impacted. And this is where this is like a pustule on the body of this society. This is where it's all coming out.
Oh, jealous, baby.
Yes. One of the things that you need to look at is that the entire system grew out of the original idea that the state knew better how to care for children than the parents did, and that the children would be better off away from their parents, and the focus was always at the outset to remove the children and discount the likelihood of them going back to the parent. It's only recently that you've had, by legislation, that they have to consider reunification. But historically, that was not the focus.
But I think the thing that, of course I agree with everything Joe just said, but I think the thing that makes this most insidious is because even with that, the research now is that they are not doing better. They're not finding better alternatives for the family. In fact, the research is that when they can be at home, when they can be safely at home, they are doing better. So even without taking them from a bad situation and putting them in a better situation, they're putting them in a worse situation, they're still taking our children. And I think the problem is huge, and I think that it can be very exhausting, and I think what we have to do is do little chipping, okay? And I shook my head in the negative when you said, can we do something here at because we're not responsible for that, we're not on that. Yes, as a society, yes, but what we can do in court is just chip away a little bit. Don't sit at home and watch white middle-class families smoking pot in the living room with their friends with a glass of wine while their kids are in the other. Don't do that. Don't just sit there and watch that and not say anything when you come to court and somebody's taking has a blunt. So what?
I'm going to go here and then we'll...
Especially if that white person is your judge. Many of us have been in that room.
Yes.
That judge.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. But I think what you're asking about change begs a really haunting question for all of us, which is, are we here, and by the nature of us even being here, do we contribute to this system? Do we allow it to work? Because we have to understand, I believe, that there is a purpose for the dependency system. Just the way there was a purpose and continues to be a purpose for the prison industrial complex. And dependency is about controlling people and dominating people and crushing people. It is not about services. So when we work here and when every 2 weeks that paycheck goes in, are we not now, how do we look at ourselves in the mirror and say, this is my job, and every time I plead a client up, which we have to sometimes, am I not allowing this to work? Every time I come to court, am I not part of it? Yeah. How do we do both? To me, that's
you can't lay that on people, Marlene. They got to pay the rent.
I agree. We all have to pay the rent, but somewhere along the line, we have to look at ourselves because I think we enable the system. And of course, we all have to pay the rent. And some of us have done this work for many years, so we have even more liability on our
What's
parts.
the solution, Marlene? You raise
I
the
don't
problem,
know.
we
That's
got
what
it.
I'm saying. What is our solution?
I think that
No, we gotta pay the rent.
I think that I recognize how difficult Joe said it would be to change. I think the one positive to changing the system is that once you get the ball rolling, I think it would snowball because I think there's a generational pattern of people who are in the system then have kids of their own and then they're in the system. And I think that once you start removing the bias and hopefully getting people out of the system, that it would snowball to avoid bringing in an entire population into the system because of that pattern of reoccurrence.
Okay, so the question was, what can we do? If you know, if you're looking at those reports and you're like, there's one strength listed for that person, your job as that person's attorney is to identify other strengths that you can then tell the court. That is a practical thing you can do, because we're not going to fix the system. So what can you do as someone's attorney? You're Joe, you sit down, you have a lot of experience, you sit down, you know what you need to present to the court. So you ask them questions. Do you have family support? How are you enrolled in services? What did the social worker explain to you? It's our job to obtain that information and then compensate for the shitty social work and present that information to the court. And that is a daily practical thing that everyone should be doing rather than trying to figure out feeling guilty, figuring out how we're contributing to ruining people's lives. Like, that is something we can do to counter what we're dealing with every day.
But we're not doing that. We're stipulating to testimony. We're not doing trials. We're not pushing back. We're allowing bench officers to say, oh, they don't have beds. They don't have individual bedrooms, so they're inadequate parents. That's what's actually happening.
Right, but Rachel, you supervise like 25 people.
I do.
Get them to do it differently.
We're working on it.
I have 5 days left.
And everyone here is, what we can do as attorneys is that we fight the system by making sure that you don't just submit on something because you want to get out early, that you make the department prove their case. And if you have to take it to trial because you've got the evidence, you fight it there. When you get to the disposition, you are prepared, you know the law, you know the cases, and you fight it. And if you don't get what you really feel you should get because you've presented the case, then you take them up. I don't care if you like the judge, you hate the judge, you've got to take them up because cases are being overturned. That's the way we do it. And every time you come to a hearing, you've got to be prepared because when I first started out and you read the reports, oh my God, all these horrible things, it must be true. Then you start putting the social workers on the stand and you start saying, well, did you do this? Where did you get this thing? Well, somebody told you, but did you ever talk to the parent? You've got to understand that the social workers, what they say, it's not always true. Not that they intentionally want to lie, but they don't always do intentionally. They don't do their full job, and your responsibility as attorney is to take each client, like they paid you the big bucks, and fight their cause and be honest with your clients of what they have to do. I mean, I always tell my clients, I'm not, I don't get your clients back. You get your clients back, but I can weave any evidence and can be very imaginative on making it look the best you can. And I also say, make the social, even though you hate the social worker, you hate me, you make the social worker your best friend. Because they write the reports. Why would you insult? Why would you say and do things that they don't like you? Because then they're trying to say that you're imbalanced. But it starts with us because we're supposed to have the knowledge and the experience. Don't lie down because of a report or it's difficult. Challenge your hearing. Challenge the court because they're making the decision. And if you really can't get what you want, then go in front and do your contest. But the original, the adjudications are important, but the disposition also, there are ways, even though they sustain, that if you have enough factual basis in your clients, you can try to get what you want. And your clients need to understand that you're working with them, because that's really important that they feel, because they'll say to me, oh, but you took my kid. I said, let's get this straight. I did not take your kid. I'm here, I'm your attorney. Oh, but you're paid by the state. I said, don't worry about that. That's not important, but I'm here to represent you. Now, you want to make my life easy, do A, B, C, and D. And if you don't, then it's going to be more difficult. But I will always fight for you if you do what you're supposed to do, or call me if you're not getting. But it does start with us, because if we start getting more things dismissed or more kids home and doing things like that, we are, in a roundabout way, actually changing the system. Maybe the social workers, and I know even with the drug issue, I mean, with all the cases that have come down and all the wonderful decisions that a lot of the attorneys have done, especially in front of 408 with those decisions, those are key. And I know with our hearing officers, we get a lot of the marijuana, we get a lot of the drug cases. She understands what the risk is, and currently, okay, I stop.
Thank you. Just one statement. So I think we all understand what the biases are with the system. And I think we need to look at our own implicit biases also. One question I have for people, and I'm going to channel Dennis Meal. He did some research and we found a study. Why do we have GALs that represent? We have GALs from mainly people of color. Like, why are we asking for a GAL to represent a parent? And most of those parents end up being black. And I'm really curious to know how many times are we asking for a Marsden hearing for someone who is black or Latino? I think those are questions we have to actually ask ourselves also. Because I know we all agree that in court it's not fair. The system is not fair. But we are a part of it also. And I think we have to look at those biases that we do have.
Just to Donna's point, I think when we're asking our clients to not be upset and to get along with a social worker who comes into their home and violates the place that they go out every day and work their ass off to pay for, it's subpar because they are renting from, some slumlord, and then you get some young social worker who is of a different ethnicity than you, does not understand your struggle, what you've gone through in your family, and starts coming in there and telling you they're going to take your kids and what you ought to be doing. That is a hard pill to swallow. So I think sometimes it's important that we, as Christina just said, recognize our own implicit bias. It might be a little bit more difficult for you than it might be for me to understand what that black man that I'm talking to is going through. So I'm not saying, like Joe, yeah, the reality is they do have to kind of adjust so that they could get their kids back. But how you ask them to do that is also important, because then you become part of the social worker in the system, and they're like, y'all taking my kids because you are part of saying, just go along, just go along. They don't really want to hear that all the time. They might know what they have to do, but it doesn't mean that they're just going to take that pill and swallow it easy. So it's our own implicit bias sometimes in asking our clients to do certain things that may also cause them to feel a certain type of way about the system and the dependency court, and especially the social worker.
But they have to understand, if they're told to do A, B, C, and D, if they don't do it or give us the reasons why they can't do it so we can address it with the court, it's going to be much harder. And I think our purpose is we want to get
Or
those
we could start
kids,
helping the court understand the
right.
bias.
We need to get those kids back to those parents, and that's what they have to understand. Because that's our purpose, regardless. And to do it in a way they make it more gentle. But the hard fact is, child under a certain age, they have 6 months. If it's child over, and when we come back and reasonable services haven't been given, that's where the big fight is. Argue about this, you know, the distance of the kid, or they're not getting transportation funds, or they're not setting up the conjoint county. That's our duty and responsibility. I mean, I've argued with my clients over here, but I've gone into the court and fought like the Dickens for them, and I'll tell them that. I'll never be as hard. I'll be hard on them, but when I go to court, you would never know what I said to them in there. Because being sugar-coated and trying to be sweet is not going to get their kids back. But you have to be respectful to them and have a feeling that they understand. And it's true. I'm white. Okay, I can't help that. I'm white, you know. And probably maybe there's certain ways I talk to what I am. So we have to be understanding. But when it comes down to it, we all want, if they're able to, and some just will never because of the life they've been through and what they're into, not going to get the gift. But we hope we can reach them so they think that we're helping them and we're here for them. We're not being paid by somebody else. With their attorneys like this, if they paid us. And that's sometimes hard to get through because I know you guys go through, oh, you took my kid, or you don't care, or you're just rubber stamping. So, but I think you're absolutely right to address them in a way that
is respectful.
Respectful.
We'll go in the back here.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, my arm got tired from holding up. So I was going to say, I agree with Rachel that enough people don't bring the social worker in. And I was just telling a couple people outside, my favorite thing to do is cross-examine social workers. And I think that is something that we can do consistently because it's the equivalent of our clients not coming in and just taking the report as is and it not being challenged. It's the same thing. We're like continuously just accepting what we read and assume it to be true. How do we know? And social workers do lie just for kicks sometimes. They do. I've seen it. I've caught them on the stand with it. You know what I mean? So when I see that there's major issues or discrepancies, I definitely have that worker, and I'm lucky to have a judge that doesn't really like the department that much. She's very happy to have workers in to testify and to hold them accountable. So I think we can make a difference in pointing out some of the differences in our cases. And I will literally say to certain county council, hey, we have this one case with these white or Asian parents and they have these kids. This family also, same set of facts, why don't they have their kids? I'm that straightforward. Like, we don't need to be around the bush with it. Like, we can actually point these things out. And I think that it's one of these issues that people don't want to say out loud because it's uncomfortable, but whatever. I think it's important to be honest and straightforward when we do recognize these things.
Here and then there.
That pointing it out, I think, is when I've done it, right? Oh, how dare you! And
I think your tone might be different than mine, though.
You may very well be right. You may very well be right, but
I say that we don't agree with it. Yeah.
but pointing out, I think, you know, it just it's trying to get people to cop to their implicit bias and to the fact that there's racism all flowing around here. That, to me, is dangerous for my clients because I see how people react to it and they get vindictive and their little emotions get triggered and they won't acknowledge that either, and now they're making all kinds of decisions that are going to affect my client's life, and they're making those decisions from a place of emotion that is foul. And it has nothing to do with anything that's going on. So while on the one hand, I think, yeah, we need to call these people out on this, on the other hand, it's like, they got all the power. Yeah. They can waltz right in there, exigent circumstances, boom. No warrant, no nothing. Kids are gone.
One of the things that I thought could be instrumental in perhaps changing the system would be some type of legislation around, I guess in criminal court, a defendant has to be Mirandized before they can be interrogated, right? They need to know that anything that they say can and will be used against them in a court of law. But here, that's not the case. You know, like these social workers can just talk to this mother or this father and elicit all types of incriminating evidence against them, and these mothers and fathers have no idea that like anything that they say can and will be used against them in this court of law. You know what I mean? So I've been feeling like for a while now since I got here that some type of Miranda rights for these parents could be instrumental in changing the system a little bit.
One of the, I don't see how we're going to change the system right now. It's almost $1 billion for LA County. And you've got the Department of Children and Family Services, the Board of Supervisors, and the courts complicit in keeping that money. How many times do we get no reasonable efforts finding? That's money in the department's pocket, which the Superior Court seems to want to do on a regular basis. Until we solve that, I don't even think we're going to get to the idea of the bias that is in the system. And the problem is with the confidentiality, what somebody really needs to do is come in here and do a true story about what goes on here. But so far, I haven't seen anybody that's got the guts to do that. For 32 years.
Really quickly going back to the point about the legislation, not only do the parents not know that those statements can go into the report, the judges, at least in my courtroom, will say, you need to talk to the social worker before you can even have visits. So that becomes, they hold their children hostage until they talk to the social worker, until those statements get into the report. So that's just something to add to your point on legislation.
Or at least record the conversation.
Yeah, I was going to go back to what Chris was saying too with the legislation. I think the hard part also is that when you get a report and like the parent doesn't cooperate with the social worker and doesn't interview with the social worker, so they don't say anything harming, you know, that could be used against them later. That is used against them because then the judge sees it as this parent was being uncooperative. And then if you have a parent that does talk, sometimes they say more than they should, and so a lot of the times when I counsel my clients, I just say, don't say more than you should. Just, you know, if you need to get in contact with the social worker, get in contact with the social worker, but they're not your friend. Like, that's normally what I tell my parents. So I don't know, I just think that there's difficulty in the way that these cases are investigated as well, because it's the department that's investigating the cases, but also staying in contact with the client to give them the services that they need to reunify with their children. So there's just so much control there.
So we're in a system that feeds its own implicit bias.
Yes.
And you walk out into the, you know, into the lobby on any floor in that courtroom and you see black and brown faces, and that's pretty much it. And those are the people that are before the judges, those are the people that are dealing with social workers, and so it seems like we're continually feeding the beast. And how is it that we can sort of stop that cycle? Like, part of it seems like it's recognizing our own implicit bias so that we can try to cut it off at that point, cut off at some point, but without a system that properly reflects the demographics, how do we even go about recognizing or having other people recognize the implicit bias that's in the system?
There are countless and countless, everyone knows, there's countless and countless studies of the disproportionality in the LA County dependency system. So I don't think there's an answer to your question, but it's something that everybody knows, and we just all, the machine keeps moving. Like, we can't stop detaining kids to try to resolve who's calling in referrals, how they're getting assessed, and who's filing it. Like, we're all trying to figure it out as we go along. So I just don't think we can solve. Right. There's no parking. More and more people are getting filed on it. More kids are talking, but we can't solve the systemic issues. Like, we are all very overworked and overwhelmed and dealing with like people losing their children forever. And I think it's putting too much on people to be like, it's your job to figure out how to solve the dependency system. Like, we can do one thing at a time, and they're practical things like counsel your client. You were interviewed briefly. Another worker's going to interview you in detail. This is what's going to happen. These are the consequences of what you say and how it's going to affect you for the next 6 to 18 months. Like, we have to educate our clients. They're practical things that we do on a daily basis, and I think people should be thinking about.
One thing I think we can do is humanize our clients before the bench officers.
an argument I've been able to be successful with is pointing out the difference between hitting with a belt, because you learn that from your parents and your grandparents, and an impulse control problem. And it's usually with my black families, and I've gotten releases. The other thing is parents going off on social workers, and they write it in the report as fast as they can, and pointing out to our bench officers that this is a human reaction to someone taking their children, and you get one or two of those, and that doesn't mean that you have an anger management problem. So I think humanizing our clients, so maybe realizing our own biases, but pointing out, not pointing the finger at, like, you know, you have this problem, but maybe, you know, like making your argument like, yes, I can see how that would seem like it's dangerous to the child. However, this is a learned behavior, and if this we give this information to parents, you know, in the parenting class and gets it. I've had a lot of cases like that over the years, where I've been able to point out the difference between a learned behavior and a loss of impulse control.
I'm not responding to what you're saying, it's just that there's something you said that popped into my head as everyone's having this discussion about what do we do. And a very unique incident happened a number of months ago that almost never happens, and no one has brought it up. But we had a judge who called a social worker out for being racist. And that judge was papered out of this building by county council. And is no longer in the building. So a miracle happened where a judge finally got it, and in that moment identified it, identified the social worker, and said the truth. And he was papered out of this building.
And 419 still sits.
So when you ask, what can we do, what do you do with that?
We've talked a lot about race and the different status of our clients, but I think it's very important to point out that regardless of race, 99.9% of our clients come from a lower socioeconomic status. I mean, really the cases that we see, people who have financial resources are on our big cases, our E's, our I's, our F's. Other than that, a majority, if not all of our cases are filed on people who are poor. And they don't have the resources. It's like an automatic judgment that they can't take care of their kids because they're poor. And that's at the most basic level. It's as soon as a referral comes in, they can't do it because they're poor. And then when they finally do overcome all these barriers, the race discrimination, the everything, when they finally overcome everything, finish all their courses that they get no help to do, then it's, we can't give you your kids back because you don't have appropriate housing, which isn't even in the law. The law doesn't say you have to have a certain standard of housing to have your kids back. But I think that a lot of times we forget as attorneys in the system that we tell our clients, you got to do this, you got to do that, you got to do this, but in their reality, they're trying to make sure that they have a roof over their head that night, let alone pay for classes and get to court and pay $6 to park to be told to come back because they didn't have time, and then get a DCFS approved house that meets the standards of people who are already judging them for so many different factors, and nothing's really going to be good enough because now they've been in this foster home that's gotten our tax dollars, thousands of dollars a month for them to live in this nicer home, and they have to compete with that. And I think that that goes ignored by the bench completely all the time.
So a lot of what I hear from this room and just in general is how difficult and impossible these problems are to change. And you know, that's not just in dependency or in the legal system, that's all over the world. And yeah, we can sit here and say, oh, it's society's problem, oh, it's this, or it's, oh, this is other thing. But I think that until individuals look at themselves, me included, what am I doing? What can I do? And doing little things, if everyone does a little bit of something, the world would change so drastically, so much faster than, oh, it's impossible, let's just give up, or what can we do? And it just, you don't have to take the world onto your shoulders, but these ideas that see something, say something. Yeah, maybe the best thing for your client is to submit, but you don't have to submit quietly. If you see something that's, pretty obviously racial or other kinds of bias, you can say something while you're submitting. And yes, you're sort of playing into the system, but the more you say it, the more people see it, the more the people's ideas can change. And I think that we have to stop looking at it as a problem that we can't fix and just look at the things that we maybe can influence.
I'm going to continue and try to wrap us up so we can I said we were going to solve racism in 2 hours. I promised that, so just so you know. But I think, for me, what's most helpful is thinking about this through critical race theory. You all are lawyers, and CRT comes from the law. Now, we use it in education, we use it in public health and the fields that I work in. But one thing that's helpful to me about CRT is a sobering reality of what we're in. So these folks, in the late 70s, right, in the 80s, were saying that racism, right, is normal, that it's not apparent, it's not an anomaly. In fact, it animates the United States, and to the largest, and it has animated the world that we've known, right? So, of course, I think implicit bias is kind of like a thermometer, right? You put it inside of society, what are you're going to get back in a racist society, our own sort of individual engagements with the thing that's animating the society. So that's helpful for me going into any sort of space, right? The justice system, we don't have any illusions. It's not going to end because there's all of these other aspects that build into it, right? It'll adapt and change and evolve to fight our own efforts. Same thing when we think about school and discipline disproportionality within schooling. We're offering restorative justice and those kinds of approaches, and those are now being encroached upon. But CRT helps me think, well, that of course is what's going to happen. So that changes my sort of strategy going forward. We're not going to destroy this. It's not going to be completely dismantled. But what we do in the day-to-day, I think, can help. And it can help people in their day-to-day lives, as you know that you're doing. I think we can be really strategic. So stories and counter-narratives have been utilized in these spaces in court to make these really powerful points that you all are naming. I think that we should, you all are the experts on this, right? But for me, from what I've learned, what I'm understanding from my own perspective, having served as a witness for juvenile cases, right, is that stories, the way we frame our stories, so going to the humanizing of these families, that can't just be hyperbole. We actually have to be engaged with folks in a humanizing way. And if you're in a support and caring role, we know that caretakers, one thing that happens for those in caring professions, which I think you all are in, you get burnt out. And so our numbing techniques might conversely, contradictorily be sort of problematic, right? We'll just end up dehumanizing, right? Because we have a hard time coping with what's happening on a day-to-day in these traumatic ways to the people that we're working for and with, and to our own selves, that secondary sort of trauma that you get, right? The vicarious trauma that you get. So I think uplifting the narratives that humanize, rehumanize, and reconnect us to each other are really important, and finding a way to strategically involve those in arguments that you make are also important. And then I was wondering too, how often do you call upon the proof, the validity, the empirical work that's behind all of the things that I'm saying today? Do you call in expert witnesses and say, in fact, this might actually be an aspect of bias? People would be willing to come and talk. They're willing to come and yes?
I have a question for you, because this has come up a couple of times in our courtrooms recently, and it has to do with exactly what you were just, I think, about to talk about, and that is using experts to deal with some of these race issues. So we've had a couple of cases, and I think they're coming up more and more frequently recently with relative placement, where you have white foster family trying to adopt black youth. And it usually comes down to this best interest analysis of one family versus the other. But what types of professionals or experts do you think that we should be looking for to educate the court on these issues in these kind of scenarios?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm happy to provide a list of people that I think you can go to, either by virtue of their research or folks that they can connect you to, right? So we're on our end in academia. You have a contingent of scholars that are attempting to intervene in all these ways. I'm working right now. UCLA is attempting to pull folks together across the spectrum of justice, right? One thing that just happened is we got some funding to work with particularly foster youth, right? And that's coming from critical folk. So there are resources that we can, that I guess we could help each other in a way. That's what I'm trying to say. Yeah. There's a way that I guess I knew kind of coming in, because I know Rachel coming into this room, that there were going to be there's agreement and alignment with the ways that we're thinking about these issues. And I say we, I guess representing folks in academia, researchers and social science folks who are wanting to lend all this work to these efforts. And so I'm happy to share names and resources with you all, and then continue the collaboration going forward. But I do think that there are some arguments that I think can be bolstered by our work, and in tandem, it's going to be difficult for people to respond to these really empirically validated studies that are showing the importance of cultural competence. I mean, that's been around for a long time, But now that's the reason I did my work, is to prove that racism kills people, right? And so for me, it's incumbent. I want it to be utilized in these kinds of spaces. That if you continue to hurt people in this way, you're actually shortening their lifespan. Well, that's pretty difficult to argue that it's better to put folks with people who are actively shortening their lifespan, right? So there are other ways that you can utilize research, but I think that's the beauty of employing social science in these spaces, and of course I'm happy to connect you all. Not just with that, but on to the other tip. There are social workers, I'm not going to try to protect or, let's say, defend social workers, but I know social workers actually in DCFS. Dominguez Hills, Cal State Dominguez Hills, has a critical race theory social work program. So the folks coming from there are infiltrating or attempting to, right, these different systems. So connecting with those individuals who are on your side. And you probably already know some social workers who, regardless of where the program, they're on your side. I think it's like looking for those pressure points of people who are doing that. To the broader perspective, I think it's taking a really hard look at what it means to have progress. So if racism is normal, I said earlier that I think we have to really get in communication with that normality. So 1619, we're coming up on the anniversary of the first slave ship in the U.S., right? 1619. We had slavery up until 1865, a few years of Reconstruction, right? And then directly into racial apartheid. Now I say if you're over the age of 53 now, and you were born in this country, you were born into racial apartheid. We've only had 53 years. We've only had 53 years of humanity for everyone, right? And we could say that that's been in contention the entire time. So for me, I actually look at us at a critical moment, colonization continues, concentration continues of indigenous communities. And I said to some folks earlier that some of the first dependency begins after the Spanish conquest of Mexico and when Mexico becomes California. Some of these first moments of dependency come with people being taken out of their communities, right? Indigenous people taken out of their communities. So it's a long, protracted struggle that we're in. And we're just players in the moment, here and now. But people have continued to fight, and I think it's incumbent upon us to do so going forward. But to take a good look at it, right? 400 some odd years of struggle, 53 years of humanity, right? That's it. And we're right smack in that moment of this experiment, okay? But I think that we can leverage that knowledge to know that what's available to do within our lifetime and our work, at least it will contribute to the longer project of ultimate liberation for folks, whether it be within their families or outside of it. We kind of talked about this, but I think individually, because the system is that all-encompassing, it does mean that we need to look internally. Where am I not quite engaging folks on a level that is human and humanizing? Where have I internalized some problematic perspectives, ways of being that might have contaminated my ability to do this practice and do it well? I think that's a question that we could all ask ourselves over and over again. You can do that with the IAT if you're interested, all right, what your particular biases may be. I have bias against different groups, regardless of the fact that I'm trying to work against it. I think that we have to get into conversation with what those biases are for us. I did talk to someone from your group here. I talked to someone from DCFS, and I talked to someone from the Children's Law Center. And I would say that the social worker from DCFS, and it was CLC 4, so it's outside the realm of CLC 1, 2, 3. And what I just brought to bear some of both the report, right, that I got, and then some of the issues that I was seeing. And so, LADL, they said, you know, we could tell, to the point, some of the social workers accidentally included information from a previous unrelated case in these reports, right? They included information, I don't want to mess this up, I believe it's something around like, they included information about drugs and that wasn't even a part of it, right? Because you could tell they copy and pasted. That was corroborated by the social worker from DCFS. We copy and paste, right? We do that all the time. She said some people absolutely have malintent. There's those few that are, you know, against folks. Also, it's an issue of capacity. My caseload is huge. So if I'm looking at an issue involving a Hispanic family that has one parent, mom who does X, Y, and Z, and I don't have time, I might just take a format or a frame that's already there and just put it right in. Okay? Absolutely, it's there. Mostly an issue of capacity. CLC said that really at the investigation level, so when the investigators go in, they felt like that could be a point of interaction or intervention. Meaning you all could talk to the investigators, right? They would be open to it. No?
They won't allow us.
Legally speaking, you're allowed.
Nice try.
That's what she said. DCFS said, yeah, absolutely. So even like I asked the social worker, well, are there ways that, because we know that these reports are not really telling the whole story, are there social workers who you feel would be willing to engage folks from LADL to tell a more complete story? But even the attempts of contacting, there are walls there, right? Because they're going to have to contact their counsel to talk to you about different things. And then there's all the risk aversion, all this other stuff happening, right? There was a case that she mentioned where, or they mentioned where there was an issue with a parent who needed to get, I guess, classes around parenting, right? And one of you all made an effort to find one of those classes, because the ones that were available weren't structured around their schedule. And it was in that moment where we found it and contacted the social worker. They were able to contact their lawyer, and ultimately the class got approved, right? And they were able to go forward. So there are these little pressure points with people of goodwill. And so I'd say if you know someone, you have social workers that you know are on your side, or on the side of the families in ways that you feel you are as well, I'd share their names. Try to collaborate with them and to share it with your other colleagues.
We can't. The county council does not allow us to talk to the social workers. So we're the only county that doesn't do. Every other jurisdiction in California, the parents' council goes to the social worker's office, they have open files, they talk, the social workers come to court. County council precludes us from contact. And recently they just put up an FYI that even our investigators can't contact the social workers, and if our investigator or we contact the social worker is to tell us, can't talk to you until I clear it with county council, and I can tell you 99% of the time county council is going to tell them, don't talk. Because they don't want what you just said. They don't want us talking to them and collaborating and trying to work out things for the parents. They don't want that.
Yeah, I don't really know what to say beyond
I think there are ways around it, Marlene.
Yeah, and the efforts, yeah.
Okay, we used to keep, 10 years ago, we kept a list of bad social workers.
Yep.
You can keep a list of good social workers, which is what you suggested. And then, it was so much fun. And share that information, but there are ways around it. You can request meetings and have the social worker meet with the parent and tell the parent what they need to do. But I think there are ways to be more collaborative without directly contacting service workers. And if you have a good county council, they are out there. They will relay the information. I like to write emails knowing that my exact email is going to be forwarded to that social worker. because that's what the county council is going to do. They're not going to rewrite it, and that way I can send whatever tone I want.
Are we all familiar with these kinds of insurgent strategies, basically? Is that something you share with each other? You all have the same kind of strategies involved?
No.
I mean, that might be a step forward, right? Here's some we know what some of these issues are. Here's an insurgent strategy framework that we're going to sort of adopt. Santa Clara County addressed their disproportionality starting in 2003. And you pulled a team, a task force of people together. Maybe that's asking too much for Los Angeles, right? For various reasons. But they have a really powerful framework. And I think if there's some way to build some forms of collaboration, so I'm saying I just reached out to friends, right? Just people that I know who happen to be in these spaces. And they were on board, right, to try to think about ways of doing this differently. So I know, and this isn't my field or my work, I know that you probably have friends too, connections as well. I think it's about bringing to bear all these different pressure points that we have systemically. And knowing that a system that is designed in this way, whether it's financial incentives, the larger maintenance of the status quo, etc., right, that it's going to try to adapt and evolve to your efforts. That we need to be very real and clear about that. But I also think that not necessarily incremental change, but interventions where we can make them are important. And if you had a guiding framework that everyone's on board, okay, how do we address disproportionality or racial disproportionality as a collective or a cohort? It doesn't have to be all the same way, but maybe some strategies, developing those. And again, I'm happy to share the report they did on Santa Clara. The folks that I talked to from DCFS and the CLC were happy to try to work with LADL, right, and try to do something along the lines of collaboration. But I think the other part of this too, that's systemic, and then there's the interpersonal, and those are reflective of each other. Right? We don't have the interpersonal bias or the microaggressions without the larger systemic reality or history. And that's what I mean by those are reminders of what your people have been through. That's what a microaggression is. It's a reminder of that long history we just showed. So that process of unlearning and really untethering ourselves to that longer history remains, regardless of what happens systemically. Right? I would argue that, in fact, that process informs the systemic process in a really powerful way. So the first thing that we can do is to continue the self-reflection and education work with each other, with ourselves. So what can we do about bias when we have it? So approaching people of color, and I mean, this is something about subtly, how do you do this with these judges or bench officers, right? That's been shown to decrease implicit bias for white people. By approach, it doesn't mean like you run up on a person of color and say, hey, how's it going? Like, I want to decrease my bias, right? But you do involve people with information about people of color, right? Humanizing information about people of color, about these families that you're working with. That has been shown to decrease bias. Mindfulness. I mean, I know it's like, at this point it's being used in a lot of different places, but it's just that moment of being present in the moment. That's been shown to decrease implicit bias because it allows us to view that long history as a sort of neutrally, right? I'm a person within this large history. I am not necessarily the person that makes it happen. It's a part of what has formed me, but it is not me, right? So I look at those events, even if you have bias with each other, because that never happens, right? Those no microaggressions ever happening amongst you all, right? But if in the rare event that it does occur, right, for both the sender and the receiver, the perpetrator and the target, it's understanding what we're wrapped up in. You know, and you all have a very sharp and critical eye about how we're wrapped up in this larger system in the work. I say apply that to your day-to-day interactions with each other and the clients that you serve, right? To not trust that things are just happening always altruistically in an egalitarian way, that things could be foul and amiss and wrong and off, because it's a part of our air, right? It's actually part of the air that we're breathing. So I think that mindfulness meditation, mindfulness in general, trying to remain present helps. How often do you take, I know this might be a struggle for you, but it's like not fair. Do you take 5 minutes to think about the work that you do and not congratulate, but honor and kind of thank yourself for that work, right? It seems to be counterintuitive. It's not going against being humble. It's actually like, here's what I know I do and why I do it. That decreases your own stress, which will extend your life, right? And it helps you be less biased and more sharp in the work that you need to do. I say that, take 5 minutes every day if you don't already. And a reinterpretation of previous events, that's been shown to decrease bias. This was an interesting study where they took, Mann and Ferguson asked people to rate a scenario where a black person and a white person broke into 2 separate houses. The black person was in and out of the house in 5 minutes, white person's in and out of the house in 7 minutes, and they said, who do you like more? You know, it's that simple. They said they liked the white person more. Surprise, you know. I guess it took their time. I don't know. And they said, okay, and they had to take the implicit bias test, right? And they showed those biases levels. And they said, okay, we're going to give you more information about this. So the black person that broke in the house was a firefighter, right? So they were in and out of the house in 5 minutes because it was crashing. They got someone out and left. The white person was actually burglarizing the home, okay? Then they had to take the implicit bias test again, and the bias went down. Right, the anti-black bias went down. So the reinterpretation, and that's where I think the counter-narratives or stories are really helpful. Reframing the story, like really reframing the story to be more inclusive of other folks' humanity can not only increase our bias, but I think can impact what happens in the courts. And there is support saying that bringing up race as a directive kind of factor in what's happening might exacerbate some of the biases from folks, but there's not much support for that. There's far more support saying that if you name something in that space, it's very difficult for people to let that go or to not see it or not talk about it. Naming race, naming class, naming these other forms of bias that are happening in the court directly could help in a positive way. At least that's what the research is saying. I've never been in there, so I don't know, you know? But I think that it's a potential pathway forward. So again, what can we do? I think we can accept that bias has, is, and will happen, which I think we're all kind of clear about that. Are we clear? Or did we solve racism already? Okay. Reflection journal, right? Having some space and time for you to take care of yourself. This kind of conversation, I don't know how often you do this with each other, but having a space for you to strategize, have inquiry and support helps a great deal. And then I'll talk about microaffirmations in a moment, but taking care of ourselves, our communities, and each other. Microaffirmations are the opposite of implicit bias and microaggressions. They are these everyday reminders, often small or brief interactions that help people feel valued. You know, so folks talk about this like a nod that you get from someone that you identify within the space. That saves your life, actually. That increases your lifespan. And that's that part of the humanizing aspect. So how often do you do that for and with each other? And it sounds like you're doing it in your everyday interactions with your clients. I would say that, you know, uplift that even more. Because you're going through stuff, we're going through stuff, other folks are going through stuff. The more that you remind people that they are valued, that they're worthy of, and I love when you say I'm fighting, you know, that you're telling them why you're fighting for them. I think being very clear about what they're experiencing, and then how you feel they're deserving of that love and care and support that you're doing within your job, that helps them, it helps you, okay? And that's about as good as it gets in our current responses to this. I think that, again, it's a sort of ongoing process of understanding how bias moves through our society. It is shifting and adapting, and it is in the room and in all these other places. So that's sobering, but at the same time, for me, I think there's hope, given that it's only been 53 years, you know, that we've even had the chance in a broad way to address this, right? So I try to think outside of my own lifetime and lifespan and have some hope for what could come as we begin to really chip away at this structure. And again, I'm grateful to be able to talk with you all. I think what you do is incredible. I'm so happy that you're doing it, and I'm happy to help support in any possible way. And I'll bring to bear all the weight of any resources that I have. So thank you for your time again, and yeah.
I think it's really important that you guys fill out the evaluation forms to give us feedback about this training specifically, and then we'll hand out the evaluation